Hello, everyone. In this episode of Big Ideas, we have with us Dr. Anup Malani, who's an economist and a professor of law at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on health economics, economics and law, and economic development. Today, he will discuss with us fertility decline in India. Thanks, Anup, for doing this with us. Welcome to this episode of Big Ideas.
Thank you for having me.
So just to start us off, can you give us a bit of a background on where we stand currently on the rate of fertility in India and how did we get here?
Yeah. So I think the top line figure to remember is that fertility rates in India are at 2. Total fertility rate. So total fertility rate is the total number of children a female will have during her reproductive life. So if a female has 2 children, you roughly have replacements. Actually, the number that most people use is 2.1. In India, you actually have to have more than 2.1 children in order to keep the population steady over the long term, because mortality rates are a little bit higher in India than, say, in other countries. India has a replacement rate fertility of 2.25. That's what it would have to have. Each woman would have to have 2.25 children to keep population stable over the long run. Instead, right now, we're at a total fertility rate of 2, which means that we've begun the process of having a declining population. And that's a real challenge. And it's a real problem for India, in part because you need people. Obviously, we value people, but if you think from a economic perspective, we need people for 2 things. First is we need people to produce stuff. Whenever you want to produce computers, buildings, cameras, you want people to provide services. You need people. People are necessary input into labor as an input into production. The second reason why humans are important is because the amount of output you get, the number of widgets you get per human depends on productivity. And as it turns out, productivity, we think, rises because there's humans. Humans come up with innovations, recently AI, for example, that makes each person more productive. Okay? And so we need humans to create those innovations required for productivity. So when we have fewer humans, we actually have less production at a level, and then we have less productivity also. And that's why this is a real big concern. To put this in context, if you go back to 1965, we had a total fertility rate of 6, but the replacement rate was 3. And what does that mean? That means that roughly 4 kids. That's a lot. You're producing 4 surviving children back then. And now we're producing just under 2.
Right.
Okay, per woman. And a woman has to have at least 2 to stabilize the population.
Right. And is this just an Indian phenomenon? How does it work?
Well, it's a global phenomenon. There are 2 types of countries. Countries that are experiencing fertility decline are countries that have already kind of plateaued at a low level of fertility. So think the developed world. They have hit kind of rock bottom in fertility. Rock bottom meaning somewhere between 1.5 and 2, roughly, is where they're stabilizing, and has been steady for a long period of time. So developed world will be Europe, United States, East Asia. Actually, some areas in East Asia, you actually have lower than even 1.5. Korea is the notable example of this, which is really, really concerning. But those Western countries have been there for decades. But they also developed earlier. They went through the demographic transition earlier, but they also went through the Industrial Revolution a little bit earlier than, say, South Asia. So that's one class of countries. Then there's a second class of countries that are on that decline. At the forefront of that is China. In terms of lower middle income country. India is a little bit behind, a few decades behind. And if you go to Africa, it has a much higher level of fertility, but even there you're starting to see these declines. So, Nigeria, I would say, is something like India in 1970.
Right.
Yeah. So everybody's seeing a decline. Really tiny areas will see some sort of stability or growth. Really, growth is incredibly rare in fertility. And when we see those, there's subpopulations. Like a small group within a particular country will have stable populations. So Hasidic Jews in Israel, something like that, but tiny fraction of the population.
Your experience as an economist and a person working in the field of health, what are some of the causes?
Yeah. So, we used to think for a long time that what's really going on is there were economic causes. And economic causes fell into 3 buckets. The most important bucket was people's incomes were rising. And the standard story, this is a story attributable to, among others, Gary Becker, who's my advisor at university. And this story was basically that when you have higher incomes, you have two countervailing effects on the number of children you have. On the one hand, people like having children. Humans like having children. So if you have more income, you want to have more children. It's a normal good. But there's a countervailing effect. As you become wealthier, specifically as your hourly wage rises, the cost of having children rises because an important input into having children, it's just like give birth. You have to raise the children. It takes time. And this is especially true for women. So the thought was you have these two countervailing effects, an income effect that pushes up your number of children and the substitution effect because the cost of children are rising. People have less children. You have these two countervailing effects. And the general sense was looking at the data, the substitution effect dominated the income effect. And so higher incomes were responsible for declines in fertility. That was embellished a little bit as over time, people realized that it wasn't just that higher income people just had higher cost of time and therefore they didn't want to have children. Instead, they were substituting away from quantity of children into investments into the quality of children, more educated children, safer children, things like that. We invest in their health. So you see a little bit of that. As you become more wealthy, you invest more in children. So that's a secondary thing. So we thought that was the dominant explanation. So that's number one. And then we'd make two other points that I think were important, especially for countries like India. As you move out of agriculture into services or manufacturing, we are doing services, but say other countries did manufacturing first, led development. You have reduced demand for children. So if you have a farm, a small family farm, you want your children to work, or you want children to help you run the farm. And so that was demand for labor, child labor in particular. That's one thing that as you do structural transformation, that goes away. So that's the second reason that people give. And a third reason people give is specifically looking at cities. So, an important corollary or correlate of development is urbanization. There's almost no country that's a higher income country that doesn't have an urbanization rate north of 75% of the population. Okay? 75% of the population living in urban areas. But if you live in an urban area, land is expensive. Housing is expensive. And another input into having a child is housing. You need to have a room or a place for the kids to play and sleep. That's another cost. So as housing prices rise. So we think that those are the three big things. And we thought that one of those three things or a combination of them would explain stuff, but I don't think the data is consistent with that. So what we've done is we've constructed this, we've calculated the number of surviving children. We call it something called an effective fertility rate. But roughly you can think of it as total fertility rate divided by replacement level fertility times 2. Okay, roughly. And we tried to see either across countries or across time what explains variation in that effective fertility rate. And we said, can it be explained by income growth? Can it be explained by the fraction of your population working in agriculture? Can it be explained by the fraction of your population living in urban areas? Those are the three theories that I think are the dominant theories, economic theories for fertility decline. And as it turns out, of the changes that we've seen in the number of surviving children, only about a third of the variation that we see can be explained by economic factors. 2/3 of the variation is unexplained. And usually then what people do with this unexplained variation, they assert that it's associated with changes in culture, the values that we have. We don't value having families anymore or something like that. We don't need children to give us identity, things like that. And so that's plausibly an explanation. I think we have to think a little bit more about that. And then once we do that, we'd have to think about how do we address that issue.
Right. Given the current state of affairs, where do you think India's headed? Are we headed towards a declining economic productivity as a country?
I think we are, but it's going to take a few decades. So a very important thing to remember is it takes time for a child to become an adult and either reproduce themselves or produce economic output as an adult. So even though today women are having 2 kids, each of them, or a little bit under 2 kids, and just under replacement, we won't feel the impact of that. That is to say, population in India won't decline for a few decades. And the reason they won't is because we have a number of young kids that are going to go and become mothers themselves or become working adults in the future. Okay. And that's already baked in. They're alive. They're going to continue. So it's going to take a few years for this fact that we're below replacement to actually show up in overall levels of population declining. So we'll continue growing for a little bit. This is called population momentum. Now we're lucky. We do have some population momentum because we have a very young population. Our age is 28. But if you look at a country like China, China has below replacements, actually closer to 1.6 rather than 2. So it's in a worse situation. But because it's been there for some time, its population's already aged. So it's immediately starting to see plateauing the population and then begins of the decline. And, I think many of the people watching this already know this. India is a bigger population than China. And that's not exactly the same thing as their population declining, but it's a marker of China's heading towards a declining population. And that's a very big deal. You need workers to produce stuff. By the way, there's another issue that's really important that we haven't discussed, which is you need not only workers to produce stuff, but if you have a pension plan, the typical way pensions work, especially society level pensions, government run pensions, is not that I save today and then I get money out later. It is that, and maybe a better example since you're younger than me, is that you put in money into the pension system, and I'm not a retiree, but I as the older person will take out. Okay, so it's a horizontal transfer from young people at a given point in time to old people at a given point in time. But if you have declining population, it's going to show up in fewer young kids first. Right. And so as the number of young kids fall, number of workers fall, not young kids, but young adults fall, there are going to be fewer people to support that pension. You're going to have a lot of leverage, and that will put a lot of strain on any kind of social welfare schemes. So I think we're going to see that consequence as well, which is different than just total output declining.
So you're reducing the pool of the social benefits in a way.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So how much of this cause of decline in fertility do you think is attributable to probably an increase in labor force participation of women?
Yeah. So that's a interesting question. So first, let me provide a little bit background. One regularity we see in the data is that when men get greater income, meaning their hourly wage rises, you don't experience a substitution effect. You only experience an income effect. And so that tends to raise the number of children that you see in a family. And the reason is because men don't participate as much in childcare. It's, a sad commentary on the role of men. That's why you're getting purely an income effect and a positive effect. But when females participate in the labor force, you have both effects. You have an income effect, but you also have the substitution effect because women's value of time goes up. And that means because they're an important input, their time is an important input into raising children, the cost of raising children rises. And that's a substitution effect. Okay. So we have this regularity. And so people have been concerned that maybe what's causing declines in fertility is women participating in the labor force. And you could make that potentially as an argument in countries where there's high female labor force participation, rising female labor force participation. The United States is an example of this. Now, this is not to say that female labor force participation should go down. I mean, these are competing values. There's value to female labor force participation. But when it comes to India, female labor force participation, first of all, is very low, remarkably low. And maybe 20%, thereabouts, depends on how you measure female labor force participation, but quite low. And the other thing is it's been fairly stable, at least stable during a period when fertility is declining. So the fertility decline, which again, we've seen linear declines in total fertility rate since 1965 to the present. That occurs during a period when female labor force participation is fairly flat. So I don't think in India it's explained by female labor force participation, which makes it a little bit more puzzling for sure. But I don't think that we can attribute to female labor force participation. That said, that doesn't necessarily imply that if you then increase female labor force participation, you wouldn't have an even more severe, not a more severe decline, but further decline in fertility. So if it was going to plateau at 2, maybe it plateaus at somewhat lower level if we increase female labor force participation. The lack of cause before doesn't mean that it couldn't have a causal impact in the future.
So given that we have a younger population who still can give birth and reproduce, what would be your sense of how should we tackle this right now? Because I think, yes, we can let it go at its level in the next 2 decades. And you said we are just below replacement level. But can we get it up in these 2 terms? I mean, not in terms of, okay, how family planning was imposed on the system, but in a different sense of, I don't know, cultural values, perhaps.
So I'm going to give you a half answer and then tell you that I don't know the full answer. So let me do this in 2 stages. First thing I want to point out is the immediate implication of this is if we cannot reverse this, we have population growth only for a few more decades. And then we're going to see declines. And we call this the demographic dividend. There's a certain period of time where we can extract value from these people. That means not just greater output, but increases in productivity, so greater per capita output, per capita income. So India is a lower middle income country. It's closer to lower than it is to middle. If we want to be a middle income country, we have to achieve that probably in 2 to 3 decades. Because after that point, we're going to face massive headwinds. So if we can't reverse this, we should at least maximize what we have. So that's like the half answer. We got to make the best of a bad situation. It's super critical that we focus on economic growth in the next few per capita income, economic growth in the next few decades. That should be our top priority. We can do all the redistribution a little bit later. It's important, but it can be done later. We need to grow. Okay. Now, that's a very grim approach. It's saying, how do we make the best of the ship is sinking, but how can we do the best while taking the sinking ship is given? How can we reverse that? I think that's a harder question. A number of countries have tried economic approaches. So Europe tries to provide very generous family leave. Sometimes you get payments for having children in some countries, things like that. I think on the whole, the evidence from that suggests that has very small effect. And it hasn't been able to reverse the trend in declining fertility in the places that have seen that. So I don't think that we're going to be able to buy our way out of the situation, right? Giving economic incentives, which is not to say that we shouldn't do it. We might be able to slow it a little bit, but we're not going to reverse the trend. Okay. Second thing that people do is they use immigration. Okay. And that's a viable strategy for some places. But you have immigration coming in. You're bringing in people. United States does that. Japan is remarkably, which is a country that has not been open to immigration, is now starting to think strong about immigration. Shows you how severe the problem is. But that's not a viable strategy for lower income countries because people don't want to come to a lower income country or a lower middle income country. They want to go to a higher income country. So I don't think immigration is going to be a solution. And in any case, that's a beggar thy neighbor solution because if you import Indians in the United States, well, then they're not in India. So India gets depopulated by immigration to the United States to some extent. Okay. So not only is it not an option, but when other people do it, it's going to hurt us. So that leaves us with how do we change people's preferences for children? And there are very few examples of successes. They typically tend to be isolated anecdotal successes that we see. Georgia has a policy that elevates the status of mothers in society. Okay, maybe we should try something like that. But we haven't seen that being successfully done outside of Georgia. And it wasn't done necessarily to promote fertility. It was just a kind of a cultural change that happened. So I don't know the answer. People have toyed with the idea and we should experiment with things like, when we go watch Bollywood movies or Hollywood movies, the paragon isn't, it used to be you have these big families, extended families, you celebrate that, and that's less and less now. Maybe what we need to do is we need to have entertainment that celebrates that sort of thing. But again, it can't be too contrived. Otherwise, people just won't watch that and they'll watch something else. So we have to think about how we can change our culture. And I think we're just beginning that project. But having a pro-natalist culture, I think is something that we have to do not only in India, but worldwide. But we can't be sure that that's going to work or that we're able to change culture.
One question that I do have is, so I think if you think of how wealthy or rich a person or a family is in terms of generations, right? Mm-hmm. We do see that generation after that generation, it does get better. Mm-hmm. So perhaps the generation which caused the decline was fighting at a more basic level that they thought that opportunity cost that they would have to pay for, like you mentioned, moving to cities, it's expensive, you have to provide for another room. That also reduces with the upcoming generation in a way, because they are not fighting for, say, your basic food, clothing, shelter anymore. They are able to live a much more privileged life, like stepping off from the previous generation. So they can think about more kids.
So that sounds plausible, but I want to, and I'm going to give you one piece of data that suggests maybe that's true. So in the United States, where per capita income is closer to 60,000, 65,000, maybe 70,000, you have a lot of people that make above 100,000. And we're starting to see that households with incomes above 100, 120,000, they're still below replacement, but they're not, their fertility is rising. So the income effect is dominating the substitution effect a little bit. Again, still, those guys are not above replacement, but they're not as bad as somebody that's, or not, I shouldn't say as bad, but not having as few kids as somebody that's in their making 60 or 70,000. Okay. Now that seems promising, right? Maybe that'll rise to a level where you'll have more kids. So, I myself have 3 children. My family is above replacement. Maybe more and more families will begin being like that as incomes rise. But if we, and that would be great news, not guaranteed, but great news. But now we have to shift to India. India's per capita income is below 5,000. To get to a level where you have such satiation, such lack of concern that you now want to go back to having kids, we don't want to wait until we get to even per capita income of $60,000, $70,000 to start seeing a return, let alone, having a bulk of the population above 100,000 in a kind of purchasing power adjusted sense, to get the returns in fertility. It could happen earlier for India. It's plausible. But, I don't know. I hope that's true. It's possible that there's just a range of incomes over which the substitution effect dominated the income effect, and income effect will come back. But that's also a little bit of wishful thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, I encourage wishful thinking.
Okay. My final question is that, seeing humans or, as just an input into economic activity, for instance, as labor, and with the technological aspects coming up, say, AI or robots, if we have to think about it as substitutes of humans, at least for some part of maybe semi-skilled or unskilled labor, do we see that as some sort of saving grace? I understand your point when you said even humans are needed for that sort of innovation to happen. But again, that's at a more skilled labor level than the unskilled part of it.
So it is true that we have innovations recently that increase the productivity of humans. Again, we're starting to see a little bit of that AI. It might take a few decades, but let's be positive about that. So you're going to see increase in productivity. And let's make the assumption that AI just augments humans and doesn't actually do innovation on its own. Okay. We'll consider the second, AI improving productivity on its own as a separate issue. It is true that will have the effect of both boosting per capita income right now, but then also compensating to some extent for the decline in the number of humans in the future. Okay. So for example, when global population turns, and starting in 2080, global population is actually declining. India's population being declining before then. We could say that total output will be able to be a little bit higher than it otherwise would have been without AI. I agree with that. I think that's correct. But again, if it's just an augment to a human, but you still need the human to use the AI, as the number of humans declines, at some point, that's just pushing back when you hit any particular level per capita income. But those per capita level of incomes, or total output at least, will decline. Now there's a second issue though. Maybe you're optimistic. You think AI is going to invent new technologies. We hear about like AI scientists and AI creating its own data and then teaching itself, things like that. I just want to point out that debate is a completely different one, and that's about the debate about our artificial general intelligence. And half the people that are talking about that are freaked out that we're going to get HAL 2000 or something, and the AGI is not going to like humans and going to replace humans. I'm not an alarmist. I think that it's quite possible that we're going to get great results with that. And it would be wonderful if, in fact, we could experience declines in human populations without pressuring anything. People should just do whatever they want to, and we're able to not just maintain the same level per capita income, but maybe even grow it. That'd be wonderful. But again, I want to be very clear that that's wishful thinking,
It's all wishful thinking.
right? And we don't know, but we do know one thing. If you just think about what thing has happened in the last century that most changed the number of humans on Earth, affected the most amount of potential lives, there's no question, I think, that fertility is the biggest one. It's bigger than pandemics. It's bigger than environmental disasters. It's bigger than almost everything, right? We will see the global population peak in 2080. And then if current fertility trends continue, even if we just freeze the birth rate under below death rates, you're going to see declining populations. That's a very big deal. We haven't seen that except for small periods of time, like after Black Death. We haven't seen that in a long time. Humans have been growing since they, since they emerged from sapiens, have been growing at least since they emerged from Africa 60,000 years ago. And we think, systematically since they started as a species 300,000 years ago. So it'll be a big change.
So I think what we can do right now, a couple of decades that we have, we increase the productivity as much as we can.
So I think that's very important. And a second thing to do is I think we need to study fertility a lot more. I think it should become a first order question. Yeah. Sorry, it's kind of a dour message. There's a problem. We better do what we can while this ship is still floating.
No.
Something like that. But I prefer to be an optimist. I hope that we will figure it out. We just have to work at it.
This was great. Thanks a lot, Anup.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.